Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of the MakdisiStreet podcast. My name is Sari Makdisi, and I'm joined, as always, by my brothers Osama and Karim. And we have today a special guest, Maya Wind. We'll be talking about her new book and the general framing of Israeli universities and their complicity in Israel's apartheid system. I want to just remind our listeners, as always, to please give us a 5-star rating on the various podcast platforms, not for our vanity, but rather because it helps boost the visibility of the podcast and all of the algorithms that these platforms use. And if you're interested in our Patreon channel, we have one now. If you're able to subscribe, that's great. It helps covers the cost of the program. And we just did a Patreon Q&A that will be up on our Patreon channel very soon. So for this week, we're happy to welcome Maya Wind to the program, as I said. Maya is a Killam postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Anthropology at the University of British Columbia in Canada. Her scholarship broadly investigates how settler societies, including the ones that at least Osama, Maya, and I live in right now, Canada and the US, settler societies and global systems of militarism and policing are sustained with a particular focus on the reproduction and export of Israeli security expertise. She's the author of the amazing book, Towers of Ivory and Steel, How Israeli Universities Deny Palestinian Freedom, which was published by Verso this year, 2024. So welcome, Maya, to the program. And as you know, we like to begin always the show by asking our guests to kind of give us an outline of how they got to where they are right now. And you could, feel free to frame it however you'd like to frame it, and then we'll get to the discussion of the book and the larger kind of issues that the book raises.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be in conversation with all of you. I've learned so much from your respective scholarship and very much appreciate this platform that you have in the conversations that you're hosting. So I came to this project, to Towers of Ivory and Steel, really out of over a decade that I've spent in the North American academic context, where Israeli universities have been broadly celebrated. And in fact, they have been granted special privileges and status. They've been awarded study abroad programs, joint research ventures, funding opportunities, a whole host of collaborations that exist between the Western university system and the Israeli university system, where no such parallel programs and privileges are awarded to Palestinian universities, or for that matter, more broadly to Arab universities or others in the Middle East. And so really, Israeli universities have for so long enjoyed this exceptional status. And this is particularly striking given that for over 2 decades now, Palestinian scholars, activists, civil society organizations have painted a starkly different picture of the Israeli Academy. So the Palestinian Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel, PACB, first issued its call to boycott the Israeli Academy back in 2004 on the basis of what they called at the time the Israeli Academy's complicity in the Israel's system of oppression against Palestinians. And so despite this fact, Israeli universities are continually celebrated as bastions of democracy and liberalism and freedom. And so I really came to research and to write this book to answer this question posed by Palestinian civil society over 2 decades ago now, which is really simply, are Israeli universities complicit in the violation of Palestinian rights?
The Israeli universities, in that sense, also occupy a position. They kind of they sort of summarize, in a sense, the status of the state itself, which has long been seen as this bastion of liberal freedoms and democracy, et cetera, in the Middle East. So let's begin, Maya, but maybe you can walk us through on this question of the Israeli universities in particular. Maybe help especially our guests who aren't so familiar with the system there. If you could help us situate the location of Israeli universities in the larger Israeli settler colonial project, both in terms of their occupation of the land, as in certain instances, like Hebrew University, for example. I know part of it at least is in East Jerusalem, and then also in terms of the forms of militarization, as in their status as towers of ivory and steel, for example. So if you could walk us through, in other words, the location of these institutions in the larger settler colonial project.
Yes, absolutely. So, I've learned so much from Indigenous scholars of education who, for many decades, have been sort of theorizing the settler university and thinking about the embeddedness and the role that universities in other settler states, including, of course, the Canadian settler state, the United States, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, others. Uh, the role that these universities have played not only as land grab institutions, but also how they have served themselves as pillars of continual Indigenous dispossession in their respective settler states. And so I found very clearly that in the Israeli case, this is also very much at play. And so Israeli universities were from the outset designed, planned, located, built as pillars of Israel's project of Palestinian indigenous elimination and replacement. And so really, as you said, it starts with Hebrew University, the very first university of the Zionist movement that actually predates the state. So the Zionist movement built universities, starting with Hebrew University as anchors of the Zionist project's land grab. And so Hebrew University was strategically built and located on the apex of Mount Scopus. And this location was selected very explicitly to stake not only symbolic, but also material and political claim to the entire city of Jerusalem for the Zionist movement. And then after 1948, when Israel consolidated its project that it called then Judaization, right? And Judaization is really Israel's term for its settler colonial project of elimination and replacement. It's the sort of the twinned project, right, of shrinking lands in Palestinian possession, interrupting Palestinian territorial contiguity, while at the same time expanding Jewish settlement across historic Palestine and facilitating the unidirectional and permanent transfer of land ownership from Palestinians to Jewish Israelis. And so to understand Judaization as the sort of official state project, we must look to Israeli universities because they have from the outset been anchors of this project. And so it is not only Hebrew University, particularly in the 1960s onward, as Israel's Judaization program expanded to new frontiers, Israel built additional universities to anchor this territorial and demographic project in regions of particular strategic concern. So, for example, in the Galilee, which is the only region within 48 where there was still a Palestinian citizen majority living after the Nakba, the Israeli state built University of Haifa to help Judaize the Galilee. And likewise, in the Nakab, which is the region most sparsely populated by Jewish Israelis, Israel built Ben Gurion University as a means to pull more Jewish Israelis from the central cities to the south and to aid in the replacement of and displacement of Palestinian Bedouins. And then post-1967, as you mentioned, the campus of Hebrew University Mount Scopus expanded to the lands of Isawiya and other neighboring Palestinian communities. And the latest accredited university is Ariel University, built at the heart of the illegal settlement of Ariel in the occupied West Bank. Again, and the accreditation of Ariel as a university went hand in hand with the expansion of the settlement of Ariel, and it was designed and built to bring more Jewish Israelis, particularly secular, from the Tel Aviv metropolitan area to the occupied West Bank as settlers. And so really what I show in this book is that for over a century now, Israeli universities have been planned, designed, and built as pillars of regional demographic engineering. And you cannot understand Israel's settler colonial project absent the role that Israeli universities have played.
So, Maya, if I could just jump in here and a quick couple of questions. One is maybe for our viewers and listeners, could you clarify, is the term Judaization, is that an official term that's used by Israeli, sort of the state, and by Israeli academia? I mean, is that something that is used officially? And then the second question on Hebrew University, if you could just expand a little bit, because again, you're the expert on this, and we're just like dilettantes on this topic. But when it comes to Hebrew University, the idea that I always had was that it was Judah Magnus who founded Hebrew, or who played a key role in the founding of Hebrew University. So how does one reconcile that history of Judah Magnus as this allegedly tolerant person who believed in binationalism eventually, with what you're talking about, this militarization? Is it something that happened over time, or was it from the outset something that was designed in the way that you're describing?
Right. So first, just to say about Judaization, this is not a term coined by left academics. This is the official terminology of the Israeli state itself. And so not only is there an entire project of state funding and government entities dedicated to the official state project of Judaization, but certainly academic literature and indeed entire bodies of work produced in the Israeli Academy refer to this term. So this is out in the open. This is the official terminology of the Israeli state itself. And in terms of the history you mentioned, this is a really important point, I think, because and on one hand, I would say Israeli universities were built to anchor Israel's settler colonial project of replacement and dispossession of Palestinians. And so, when we come to understand, when we look at the lands on which they were, the very lands on which they were founded, and the ways in which they were built, they could not have been built otherwise. They were built very directly to service this project. But I think that the story of Hebrew University is important because it was not only the first university of the Zionist movement, but it was also incredibly influential in sort of shaping the trajectory of Israeli higher education more broadly. And you are right to point out that Judah Magnis, the first president of Hebrew University, and others, in fact, of the early founders and leaders of the institution in the state, in the early decades of the institution leading up to the 1948 war, did have a different vision for the university, one that was more akin to what we can understand the traditional idea of a university as a sort of an institute aspiring to scientific excellence and independence. But the trajectory of Hebrew University under Magnis's leadership was very much contested by many leaders of the Zionist movement. And already in the lead up to the 1948 war, the campus was used not only to refine and develop weaponry, including biological weaponry, typhoid dysentery, that was developed by a Hebrew University doctoral student who led the foundation of the biological department of the Haganah Militia's Science Corps that operated a base out of Hebrew University. And so already in the lead up to the 1948 war, faculty and students at Hebrew University, as well as in the Weizmann Institute and the Technion Institute, already themselves participated in the development and manufacture of weapons very explicitly to aid in the project of Palestinian dispossession, in the lead up to the Nakba. And so, but then after the Nakba, what we see is that, so I'll just go back for a moment. So we already see that even under Magnis's leadership, and even before the Israeli state was founded, sorry, I'm losing my train of thought. So even in the lead up, even under the ostensibly more what could be understood as more progressive leadership of Magnis and others, this was already contested, and the campus de facto already served in the project of Palestinian dispossession. But then what we see post 1948 is sort of the consolidation of a new model, which is a university in service of the state. And that is the trajectory of Hebrew University. And that became the trajectory of every university that followed. And so really we see in the 1950s and 60s is that the Israeli state also established a tight control over Israeli universities. At the time, Prime Minister Ben-Gurion himself handpicked the presidents of Israeli universities. Some were not even academics. One was a former chief of staff. And so you really see that in the 1950s, the direction of Israeli universities as institutes in service of the state really was consolidated, and that has been the trajectory ever since.
Maya, can I just ask a kind of clarifying question? In the more kind of contemporary period, so let's say during the Oslo process onwards, was there a shift as the sort of more liberal elements at that stage, were trying to, this question of peace process, the question of kind of building bridges, the question of trying to at least create an image of more kind of inclusiveness, at least an image as it appears from the outside. Were there any shifts, or did the universities in this mission you've been talking about kind of continue as though nothing changed, sort of from the history?
Well, I think if we think about, so in the book, I look at different forms of complicity and entanglement of the Israeli Academy with Israel's project of Palestinian replacement and dispossession, and also later military governance and apartheid rule. And so if from that perspective, the role that Israeli universities have played in service of this project has been very much continuous. So if we're looking at, for example, knowledge production to aid in the governance of Palestinians with military and apartheid rule, what we're seeing is that dominant paradigms of entire academic disciplines have been for decades subordinated to the requirements of the Israeli state and have been producing knowledge and expertise to aid not only the Israeli military government, but the Israeli government more broadly in apartheid rule. We're seeing, if we're looking at the development and manufacturing of weapons too. So the Israeli Academy, in fact, birthed Israel's military industry. So Rafael, for example, was the foundations for Rafael, Elbit Systems, Israel Aerospace Industries, Israel's largest weapons producers and now global exporters. These were initially state-owned military industries, and they developed out of infrastructure laid by the Technion and the Weizmann Institute. And in fact, it was Israeli scientists, many of whom were based at Israeli universities themselves, who advocated that the science corps of the Haganah militia eventually, and this later became the science corps of the Israeli military, be detached from the military and brought under the aegis of the Ministry of Defense, where civilian scientists, and particularly university scientists, could have actually more control. And they advocated for this in part because they wanted Israel not only to import technologies and weapons, but also to develop and manufacture its own. And so really what we see is that Israeli military industries that now, of course, have for decades been honing and developing their technologies and weaponry used against occupied Palestinians before being exported abroad as battle-proven or field-tested, these industries were actually not only birthed by Israeli academia, but Israeli university campuses continue to serve as critical laboratories for these industries. And industry leaders themselves openly speak to the fact that absent Israeli universities, you would not have the scale and the global acclaim of these industries. So they are absolutely central. The former chairman of Elbit Systems called the Technion Elbit's DNA. And more recently, just now in response to the growing traction of the academic boycott, the leader of the INSS, the Institute for the National Security, the Institute for the National Security Studies in Tel Aviv University, who was also formerly the Council for Higher Education's Planning and Budgetary Committee head, recently came out and said Israeli university that he was expressing concern about the growing traction of the academic boycott and the isolation of the Israeli Academy, because he said that the international collaborations are the oxygen of the Israeli Academy, and the Israeli Academy is the oxygen of Israeli high-tech and military industries. So we really see that the academic boycott is directly threatening not only the Israeli Academy, but also the Israeli military industries.
Maya, this is great. We're going to come back to the question of boycott in a bit, but and then we're going to talk about the kind of institutional racism of the Israeli, the academy. But just on this question that we've been touching on now, in fact, we began by talking about your interest, obviously, in settler colonial societies and settler colonial institutions, and of course, yes, of course, the Israeli educational institutions are part of a settler colonial fabric, but of course, so is UBC, so is UCLA, so is Berkeley, so are all of the American and Canadian universities. And of course, I can't speak to Canadian universities, although I assume it's the same there. But certainly in the US, the university systems are also bound up in all kinds of ways with Pentagon funding and so on and so forth. So I'm just wondering, just at a kind of, since you've operated, these two worlds, how, what does, I mean, there's no question. I think, but more than I do. I think Israeli universities are worse and more complicit and offer less of a space for critique and freedom, which we'll get to in a bit, compared to North American universities. But I don't know, when you compare these Israeli institutions to their North American counterparts, since they're all enmeshed with settler colonialism, with military technologies, with the state, with surveillance, all kinds of things like that. But do you see a difference in some substantive way also between North American institutions and Israeli ones? Like one thing, I don't know, this is a small thing, but it maybe even if it's gestural, it may have, may point to broader significance. For example, I know you do it in Canada. We now do it in the US. We didn't used to, but like, at the beginning of every talk, there's always a land acknowledgement now, which certainly wasn't the case, I don't know, 10 years ago or so. My first exposure to land acknowledgements was actually when I went to Australia the first time, maybe 15 years ago or so, because there it's absolutely routine, or it was by then. And I know, as I said, now it's systematic, and everywhere you go in the U.S., everything begins with a land acknowledgement. The same thing in Canada. I know. I can't imagine that they do like I don't think that at Tel Aviv University talk they begin by saying, "This is the land of Sheikh Mohannes. We want to acknowledge I'm sure they don't do that. But like, what are, in broad terms, what are, other than the similarities, which are clear, what are there more also substantive differences in general, like, across the board, general terms between these North American settler colonial institutions and the Israeli ones? If that seems like a reasonable question, I hope that was clear.
No, I think that's a crucial question. And I think, on one hand, you are absolutely right to point out the fact that Israeli universities can and must be understood in the much longer tradition of the settler university in other settler states, as you mentioned, the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and Israeli universities in that sense are founded just like their other settler university counterparts through on lands that were cleared through genocide. They were found, in other settler states, they were also subsidized by the spoils of the slave trade. So certainly Israeli universities can and must be understood in that longer trajectory and that longer history of the settler university. And I think you're also right to point out that Israeli universities can also be understood as akin to the U.S. Cold War university, right, where there was a deep entanglement between the state, U.S. empire and U.S. military industries, the military-industrial complex, and its universities, certainly. But I think there are three sort of cardinal differences, really, that do make Israeli universities stand apart. And I think the first and most important to my mind is that the communities most directly impacted by the violence of Israeli settler universities, which are, of course, the Palestinians, they have called for a boycott. So to me, that is one very most important and crucial and substantive difference. And a second, and I think that for a second difference that is important to point out to is that, we all have our critiques of the international legal system. I think we have seen over the last 8 months with utter devastation the profound limitations of this system to provide accountability and justice. But nevertheless, legal designations can and should mean something. And so the fact that there is now broad international consensus, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, Israeli human rights organizations, UN special rapporteurs, legal scholars who are experts on this topic, there is broad consensus now that Israel is a state of apartheid. And that legal designation has to mean something to us. And so the fact that Israeli universities are now pillars of what is a widely understood system of apartheid, legally speaking, needs to makes them stand apart from their counterparts elsewhere. And so that is another cardinal difference, I think. And the third difference, and this kind of speaks to your point, is I do think there is a difference both of degree and of kind between the entanglement of Israeli universities with Israel's settler colonial system and regime of apartheid as compared to others. So it is not only, for example, you can speak to ROTC and other comparable programs that entangle the U.S. Academy with the U.S. military. But in the Israeli case, it is not only that they are training, for example, future or former soldiers. It is that every Israeli university runs multiple tailored degree programs that totally merge military and academic training, and they are explicitly designed to offer the Israeli military a cadre of highly specialized and skilled soldiers amidst a draft of otherwise high school seniors. And so these degree programs are actually training Israeli soldiers through the university system to carry out their work, to enhance their operations. And that work is the work of maintaining an illegal military occupation and a system of apartheid. So that is, one example. And again, speaking to the role, Israeli military industry leaders themselves compare the Israeli military industries to those in the United States and say that unlike in the United States, Israeli universities are critical laboratories and lay absolutely central infrastructure to these industries, whereas the United States, you have many other types of independent laboratories and other sites where that kind of expertise is honed and developed. So really, there is both a difference of degree and of kind in terms of the extent of the entanglement and the imbrication of the Israeli university system with Israel's system of apartheid.
So that, Maya, if I could, that sort of links or answers very, very sort of eloquently, in fact, and directly the charge that's often brought up in response to books such as yours or criticism such as yours and ours collectively of the complicity of the Israeli academia with the oppression of the Palestinians, both temporally, chronologically. So you said three things. The fourth thing would be, of course, the anachronism. We're in 2024. We're not in the 19th century or in the early 20th century. We're in the 21st century, and this is still happening. But the question then is, when people come to you and say to you, "But Maya, but American institutions, you're singling out Israeli institutions because American institutions are also complicit in settler colonialism." I think the answers you gave, in fact, are those the answers you would give to tell people this is the difference? These are the 3-4 key differences between U.S., Australian, New Zealand, South African institutions and Israeli institutions, because
Don't forget Canada, eh?
and Canada, because oftentimes we're told, "Oh, you're singling out Israel," and you're saying that's just, from what I hear you're saying that it's absurd to make that argument.
Absolutely. And I would actually say that what is happening is precisely the reverse, which is that Israeli universities and their supporters are the ones who are requesting and even demanding that Israeli universities be singled out. They are asking that the Israeli universities be exempt from the very same criticism and processes of decolonization to which we are subjecting universities across other settler states. Right. So at University of British Columbia, where I am based, and elsewhere, there are broad processes underway where led by Indigenous scholars and students, where there's a global movement, in fact, to decolonize higher education and to hold universities in settler states accountable for their deep complicity in Indigenous dispossession and genocide. And so what the Israeli universities are in fact asking is to be held apart and to be exempt from this scrutiny and this broader global movement for decolonization.
Maya, I want to, you mentioned a little bit earlier that there were this, I'm curious if you could just give a bit more example or maybe elaborate on the program that you're talking about. That it struck me that I think you said that the Israeli soldiers, that there was kind of training, but that is in kind of social science and kind of humanities programs that are mixed with the military programs. What is that? Can you just kind of elaborate a little bit more what that entails?
Right. So there are over 50 such degree granting programs across every single Israeli public university, where Israeli soldiers are being trained as soldiers and prepared for their work through the university system. And one example of this, a program that recently transferred to Hebrew University, and in fact the Department of Islamic and Middle East Studies at Hebrew University, which is the leading department in the field in Israel, now hosts Chavat, which is a program, a tailored degree program where Israeli soldiers are trained in Middle East studies and another selected field in preparation for extended service in the intelligence corps. And what they are being trained in and through Hebrew University is in intelligence methods. And many of these graduates then go on to serve in Unit H200 of the Israeli Intelligence Corps, which is responsible for the broad surveillance of Palestinian society, including cultivating the most sensitive and personal information in order to extort Palestinians into collaborating with the Shin Bet or the Israeli military, information such as medical treatments needed by a loved one, sexual orientation, financial difficulties. These are the kinds of information that is harvested by the Israeli military, by soldiers who are now, some of whom are trained at Hebrew University at the Department of Islamic and Middle Eastern Studies. And so what you see in programs such as this is that Israeli universities are directly serving to hone the capacities of the Israeli military to more effectively and permanently govern Palestinians through military rule. And now some of these soldiers and the graduates of eight who are now serving in Unit 8200 are actually aiding the Israeli military in creating target banks in Gaza. So they are directly implicated in this genocide as well. And so this is just one of many such programs where the Israeli university system is offering its expertise, its facilities, and its faculty to hone the capacities of the Israeli military government.
If we go from the university level down to the kind of professor level, the teachers, the professors, the staff, how should we think about that? I mean, okay, so there's something that one can think about institutionally. We're going to come back to that. But how do we think about the professors that are, complicit with this, whether, willfully and they kind of know exactly what they're doing, or indirectly and they sort of kind of know but don't really know and they don't want to know, or they're burying their head? How does that work?
So I think, to my mind, one of the most powerful things about the analysis of PACB, the Palestinian Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel, has been that it has always attended to structure. So the PACB's analysis has always asked that we look at structure and that we understand that the problem here is the structural and institutional complicity of Israeli universities with Israel's system of settler colonialism, apartheid, and now genocide. And so in a broad sense, it doesn't actually matter who is inhabiting the Israeli university, so long as these structures are put in place and are maintained. Having said that, of course, they could not be sustained absent the broad participation and consent, but again, not only passive consent, but active participation of the overwhelming majority of Israeli university administrators, faculty, staff, and students. And so this is also, in my research, one of the things that I look at is how settler societies reproduce themselves and reproduce violence and indigenous genocide and dispossession. And in the case of settler states, and certainly in the Israeli case, we must also attend to the active participation and the complicity of the settlers themselves, because these systems do not maintain themselves. There are people, there's labor that goes into sustaining these projects. And so, of course, absent this broad consent and willing participation, these programs could not be sustained. But again, the boycott and the call for academic boycott is really a targeting of institutions and institutional complicity.
No, this makes perfect sense, but I'm trying to just to kind of wrap myself around this. So, you're saying you're arguing that, of course, there is a structure, and sort of from the boycott perspective, there is a structure. That's clear. But at this still, we're all professors, we're all kind of teach, we're all in these kinds of academic institutions. So at that level, I'm curious, are there discussions taking place?
Is there awareness? Is it like awareness, Karim? Is that what you're talking about? Yeah.
Is there awareness? Is there some group that's going, do they go into little hushed kind of, green rooms and say, oh yeah, we know, but we're not going to say anything? Or is this completely and utterly ignored? Because we're going to talk soon about the fact that they're Palestinian, at least in some of these universities, Palestinian students and professors, we're going to talk about that. But so surely they're not living on Mars. They must be aware of the role they're playing, and then either say, well, what can I do? I'm just an employee. Or say, yeah, well, I'm committed to this Zionist project, and so therefore this is part of it. So I'm just curious about the way in which they, not that you can talk about everybody, but sort of, insofar as anybody can generalize, how, are they aware? Are they not aware?
Yeah, so in my own dissertation research, I looked a lot at the ways in which the consent and buy-in to the Israeli settler project is produced and sustained by a whole host of citizens, and the kinds of forms of experimentation, social and scientific experimentation that are underway in Israeli society itself, precisely to maintain such consent and active participation. So I think we have to understand, no university is an ivory tower, and Israeli universities are no exception. They are deeply embedded, and therefore they're also representative of the broader public and society that they serve. And so what we are seeing in Israeli universities is what we are seeing broadly across the board in Israel, which is incredible buy-in into the project of Palestinian elimination and replacement. So, and we are seeing this now. Also over the last 8 months of the genocide. This genocide is sustained by the active labor of thousands and thousands of people, not only soldiers, not only the media, but the genocide requires broad labor and broad participation by Israeli society, and that is what we are seeing now, and that is what we have always seen in Israel. And so universities are really emblematic of this broader problem. I think, of course, there is dissent in Israeli universities, as there is in any society. Palestinian students and faculty in particular are at the forefront, I would argue, of this dissent and have been continuing to mobilize, to produce critical scholarship, to protest, to speak out in incredibly courageous ways. And they're at the forefront of the Palestinian liberation movement, certainly. And that's true not only in Israeli universities, but also in Palestinian universities under occupation. And there are, of course, also dissenting Jewish Israelis. There are collectives and organizations, Academia for Equality and others, that are operating within the Israeli academic context that are mobilizing. But what we have to, but these initiatives and these movements do not have the numbers or the power required to sustain any significant change, which is why also the boycott is being called for.
Maya, on that point, actually, on the role of Palestinians in the Israeli educational system, of course, we all know Israel always advertises itself, and its friends here in the West advertise it as this bastion of liberal tolerance, equality. We treat all of our citizens equally, et cetera, et cetera. So, can you tell us a little bit about the situation of Palestinians within the Israeli academic system, meaning professors, but also students? Like what is if a Palestinian student, when they finally get to an Israeli university, I'm talking obviously about a citizen of the state, what is their path even to get to the university? And then to the extent that you're able, I know that your project is on the universities, not the K through 12 system, but could you say a little bit just to outline the forms of racism and discrimination built into the K through 12, the primary and secondary educational system that then helps determine the path taken by those Palestinian citizens who make it to a university at all? And then we'll talk about what's going on in these places in a little bit. But just to talk about the situation, the forms of discrimination encountered by, or is it true? Is everybody equal? Is it all wonderful? Is it a wonderful basket of cherries? Thank you.
Right. No, that's an incredibly important question. And of course, Israeli Jewish and Palestinian schools are overwhelmingly segregated. And again, as we are talking about Palestinian citizens of Israel. And of course, there's persistent and intentional disinvestment in Palestinian citizen education. And this, of course, is part of Israel's broader war on Palestinian education, what Karman Abulsi and others have called scholasticide. But really, over the past 25 years in particular, there has been consistent documentation by international bodies such as the UN and Human Rights Watch, Palestinian and even Israeli civil society organizations, and also Palestinian scholars, many of whom are based themselves in Israeli universities, that there is pervasive discrimination in education between Jewish and Palestinian citizens of Israel. Palestinian schools remain severely underfunded, their buildings are inadequately resourced, they're physically inaccessible, and there's persistently higher dropout rates in Palestinian schools than there are in Jewish schools. Admissions for BA degrees is based on both high school baccalaureate grades and the grades of the Israeli standardized test for higher education. And by both criteria of evaluation, Palestinian high school graduates are at a severe disadvantage. And so we see this, that Palestinian students face many barriers to higher education, and we see this manifest in the enrollment. So from data, for example, from the academic year ending in 2022, shows that Palestinian students remain severely underrepresented in Israeli universities. They made up just over 16% of bachelor's degree students when they make up over 30% of university-age citizens in Israel. Their numbers shrink also as you move up in the university hierarchy. So Palestinians make up over just 11% of master's students, 8% of PhD students, and only 3.5% of university faculty. This is and so again, when they account for over 20% of the Israeli citizen population. In 2019, Israeli Ministry of Finance research concluded that the integration of Palestinians in Israeli universities is currently in decline, and that the gaps in access to education between Palestinian and Jewish students are not only not shrinking, but they are in fact widening. And so while we see that Israeli universities are now touting their programming and integration of Palestinian students, and in particular, they're working to counter, they're touting this in their attempt to counter the cascade of wins for the academic boycott that we've seen in recent months, the actual facts and data are routinely manipulated. But what I think that the debates about numbers obscures is also a more foundational and structural problem, which is really that Israeli apartheid, and specifically the distinction between enrolling Palestinian students or the mere presence of individual Palestinians on Israeli campuses and the disallowing of the Palestinian identity and more importantly, Palestinian politics on campus. So this is a very important distinction I think that needs to be made. So like their presence and inclusion in the Israeli state as citizens, Palestinian enrollment in Israeli universities has always been considered an undesirable inevitability by the Israeli state and by Israeli university administrations. Their access to Israeli universities was itself fiercely debated and resisted before ultimately being reluctantly tolerated. And so Palestinians are closely policed in Israeli schools because the Israeli state has always been incredibly concerned about Palestinian schools as sites of fomenting national liberation ideas. And the Israeli educational system seeks to create, this is what anthropologist Khalid Fouani argues, it seeks to create Israeli Arabs, he says, closed in a box and reconciled with Zionism and with its state. And so Palestinian students graduating from this system arrive to the Israeli university in hopes of finding a different space. Yet on their arrival, and this has been shown consistently by Palestinian scholars based at Israeli universities, when they arrive to the Israeli university system, Palestinian students find that these institutions too are embedded in Israeli society. And here I want to again quote Fouani. He puts it, he says, the Israeli universities whose existence is based on the negation of Palestinian existence. So it's not only students, but also young scholars, Palestinian scholars quickly come to understand the structural barriers to their exploration of Palestinian history and identity in classrooms discussions, in their own thinking and writing. And of course, you see this most explicitly in any sort of political mobilization on campus. So this is a state, these are the structural problems that exist in terms of Palestinian citizen access to higher education and the conditions that to which they are subjected upon their arrival to the Israeli university.
So Maya, sorry, may I just jump in here? Maya, on this point, so first of all, how successful then, in your estimation, has this project of producing so-called Israeli Arabs been? In other words, people who then are used to sort of promote and brand Israel as tolerant in the face of what you're talking about and what many Palestinian, obviously, scholars and students and parents and staff have pointed out, the extraordinary racist nature and the discrimination, the built-in, baked-in segregation. But how successful have the Israelis been? That's one question. In other words, how many Palestinians, in fact, use this or have fallen for this kind of thing for whatever reason? That's one question. Are they the face, in other words, or is there a chance that they will become the face of Israeli apartheid, in a sense? Is that part of the planning and thinking? And then the second question, this is really based on Sadi's work as much as your work, Maya, but the whole question of, my sense is that the Israelis don't actually say, for example, that we discriminate against Palestinians in those terms. It's never put in such blatant, maybe they say it unofficially, but officially they always say, we're not doing this, we're something else. So how does that actually sort of, how do you point to a specific, law or set of structures that actually can give people a sense of the actual segregation and discrimination beyond the numbers that you mentioned?
Yes, certainly the numbers really don't tell the full story, because the question is also what happens to Palestinian students and scholars when they try to enter the Israeli academy. And so one of the things that where you see this most clearly is with the question of the Nakba. So the Nakba, of course, is the foundational event and structure from the Palestinian perspective. And so what we have seen in the Israeli academy is a persistent curtailment of the capacity to research, to study, to discuss the Nakba on Israeli campuses. The most foundational event that also, of course, itself created the conditions of Israeli citizenship for Palestinians. And so in repressing its study, what the Israeli Academy has done, it has repressed and it has purged the most foundational research questions from the Palestinian perspective from its campuses. And so we see this, that the issues most central to a Palestinian concern are being consistently disallowed on Israeli campuses. And we're seeing that, over decades, many of the most critical Palestinian scholars and even critical repressed, and it has purged the most foundational research questions from the Palestinian perspective from its campuses. And so we see this, that the issues most central to a Palestinian concern are being consistently disallowed on Israeli campuses. And we're seeing that, over decades, many of the most critical Palestinian scholars and even critical anti-Zionist Jewish Israeli scholars have been forced to leave the academy. And those who remain operate, and this came across very clearly in the many interviews that I conducted with both Palestinian and Jewish Israeli critical scholars across the Israeli university system. They are inhabiting the university in a state of siege and are consistently being silenced and facing harassment from their students, from their colleagues, from the university administrations. So that is something to note. Palestinian students also inhabit campus differently, and this was really striking spatially to me. And Palestinian geographer Yara Saad Ibrahim writes about this very beautifully as well, about the ways that Jewish and Palestinian students differentially inhabit the physical space of campuses. So for Palestinian student organizers, they have for decades been mobilizing against the armed guards, former Israeli soldiers who are stationed across the entrances of every Israeli campus and describe the process of entering their campus as akin to crossing a military checkpoint in occupied Palestinian territory. And so what we see is that even in the campus itself, Palestinians have to carve out and try to find peripheral spaces where they can speak Arabic freely, because, for example, at Hebrew University in 2022, students were arrested just for singing in Arabic on the campus lawn, right? And so what we're seeing is that sort of the overt policing of Palestinian and the disallowing of the Palestinian identity of Arabic, wearing kafiyas, all of these are heavily policed. And so Palestinian students not only generally minimize time spent on campus as compared to their Jewish peers, but also inhabit space differently. Even in campus lecture halls, I noticed that was something very striking, is that Palestinians often sit together in one corner of the room. And there's such pervasive segregation spatially, really across the Israeli university campus as well. But we're also seeing a really big difference in the ways that Israeli university administrations are treating Palestinian and Jewish organizing on campus, and that is also very striking. So over decades now, even the Israeli State Comptroller, they just are not granted permits to hold these events on campus. Their student groups are suspended routinely, and now increasingly, and we see this in particular over the last 8 months, but this is really a longer history, and over decades, that Israeli universities have been calling on the Shin Bet and police to come and arrest Palestinian students from their own campuses. And of course, we've seen a terrible escalation in this repression over the last 8 months. And actually, let me just pull up. I can have just the statistics because I don't have it on hand, but I want to maybe speak to that for a moment. So if I could just add to this. So according to Adala, the Palestinian civil rights organization, sorry, I'm looking at I want to get this right because this is a statistics that's important. So according to Adala, the Palestinian civil rights organization, as of May, over 160 Palestinian students faced disciplinary action. 34 of them have been suspended or expelled from the Israeli university system. Several universities actually referred also complaints against Palestinian students to the Israeli police that also resulted in their arrest and indictment. Universities set up screening committees to assess social media posts to determine if students should be suspended or expelled. At Bar Ilan University, for example, this committee was made up not only of academic and legal experts, but also security experts, so-called, to assess whether student posts could be construed as identifying with what Israel calls terrorism. And so they have invited students and staff to report on each other and to send in complaints to the university. Several Palestinian students were interrogated and even indicted for images posted on their social media. They were strip searched, they were humiliated, detained, subjected to terrible conditions while in detention, kept in overcrowded cells, subjected to abuse. Some were arrested from their family homes. So there's really been an escalation in repression of Palestinian student organizing, in particular over the last 8 months.
Maya, just to clarify, did you? I mean, this is, in a sense, it takes a few seconds to digest all of this, and it's once you go into the specifics, it's much worse than one can even imagine from the outside. No matter how bad, did you say that Arabic is not allowed on campuses? You mentioned that they're arrested if they're singing in Arabic. Did I misunderstand that?
So, so first of all, as of the 2018 nation-state law, Arabic was downgraded, right, in the Israeli state from an official language. But this is also something that is worth noting. Palestinian civil society organizations and Palestinian scholars have been pointing out that Arabic is absent broadly from the Israeli university campus. Signage is incorrectly or partially translated, so too are the university websites. Generally, from the Israeli campus, Arabic does not awarded, certainly not only the status of Hebrew, but even the status of English. So there's much more English on Israeli campuses even than there is Arabic. And so this sort of linguistic absence is very much central to making Palestinians feel that this university is not their home and that they do not belong and cannot belong in this university system. But yes, also, the Palestinian identity is policed, and even to the extent of including Arabic. So in Hebrew University Mount Scopus campus in 2022, 2 Palestinian students were sitting on the lawn and singing in Arabic, and a fellow student who is also a police officer found this to be suspicious and accused them of incitement and called on, even though he was off duty, called on the police to come to campus and arrest these students. These students were arrested. They were interrogated by the Israeli police about their views on the state of Israel, and they were eventually released, but they were barred from campus for several days. And what is striking about this is also the response of the Hebrew University administration. So Palestinian students groups mobilized and demanded that Hebrew University clarify its position and its policy pertaining to the arrest of Palestinian students from its own campus. And Hebrew University refused to condemn this arrest on its campus. It refused to intervene to allow these Palestinian students back onto its campus despite the police barring them. And it also vaguely promised to clarify its regulations, but it did not actually institute any change or any new policy to prevent these kinds of events from taking place again. And so this is just one of many examples of the policing, the pervasive policing of the Palestinian identity on Israeli university campuses.
Maya, I want to push you a little bit more on this, because again, it's a lot to digest. The question of I want to get back to the person level. I'm assuming that if I were to ask you, is it going to get worse and worse? I imagine you'd say yes. It's just going to keep getting worse. These kinds of restrictions, the kind of attacks, the kind of discrimination, de facto, not just sort of the laws, but like the policing. Even So the question is the students themselves. Again, I know, I'm curious about, if I'd like to think that if any one of us were watching this thing, we would do something, we'd say something, at least, at a very basic level. So I'm still curious too, because for example, reading about the genocide, you see that 80 plus, maybe 90% of Jewish Israeli society is kind of pro-genocide or supportive of the Israeli government policies. Here, I'm getting the impression that students, if not are like, very, very pro kind of, attacking Palestinian students, they're at the very least not doing anything. I'm sure there's some, but sort of as a vast majority, they understand this, they let it pass, they probably think it as very normal in this kind of superior way, and in sort of enable this kind of apartheid at that individual level. When we meet students abroad that are coming from these universities, I'm just curious, am I correct? Or are they attempting, and the administration kind of locks them up as well, or threatens them, or says something? Is there a movement? Is there attempt to change the system there? Is there attempt even at individual university levels, even at individual classroom levels? Or is it complicity that goes among all the students?
Yeah, what we're seeing in Israeli university campuses is really the inverse or the mirror image of what we're seeing across Western campuses over the last 8 months. Whereas in North America and Canada, whereas in North America and Europe, students are now rising up in unprecedented ways with the encampments and mobilizing against the genocide, mobilizing for decolonization here and in Palestine. What we're seeing in Israel is the inverse. So the National Student Union just a few days ago promoted a bill in the Knesset under which universities will be required to fire staff and lecturers if they denied the existence of the state of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, or what Israel defines as incitement to terrorism, or so this is support for armed struggle. So this is legislation that was pushed for by the National Student Union of Israel. And the union also paid for billboards across the country inciting against Palestinian and leftist Jewish Israeli faculty, including Professor Nadera Shalhoub-Kevorkian. So this is just one example of many to really illuminate the pervasive participation of the overwhelming majority of Jewish Israeli students in the policing of Palestinian politics. They're also combing through, and this is particularly over the last 8 months, but this really does have a longer history that I track in the book. They are combing through these social media posts and reporting on their fellow students. They are brandishing weapons and walking around with their weapons, some from their personal arms and some their military M16s. They are showing these weapons to their colleagues, their Palestinian student colleagues, as they pass them in the hall. They are intimidating students, and we saw this very directly also in response to the Unity Intifada in 2021. But things have gotten worse since. That the overwhelming majority of Jewish Israeli students are actively participating in the suppression of Palestinian politics on Israeli campuses.
Maya, what you're saying, even though I've read your book and I know some of the context and so forth, we all do, but just hearing you lay it out like this, it just gives this image of I don't know, I think I'm out of words to describe what it is we're hearing in a sense.
It
Yeah,
sounds
go ahead.
sorry. It sounds like if I could interrupt, it sounds like what the U.S. South would have been like 100 years ago, but actually vastly like as I said, we're in 2024 and there's a genocide taking place. It's just beyond belief, actually.
It's just completely it's out of whack. Yeah, we could talk more about that, but I do want to turn to the case of Nadera Shalhoub-Kevorkian, partly because she's a friend of all of ours, partly because she was on our podcast, and it's partly because, as everybody knows by now, this is public knowledge, she was arrested shortly after she appeared in our podcast. And I'd like you to walk us through the university's role in her case and what happened, and if you could just sort of summarize, where things were, where things stand in her case, because I think it's sort of symptomatic of the larger patterns that you're talking about, not just the institutionalized racism of Israeli universities, but also the pointed, racism against specific Palestinian faculty or students or whatever. And obviously it's an instance of the blind injustice of the Israeli so-called legal system, writ large. So yeah, please tell us, for listeners who don't know, just give a summary of the case and then where things stand right now. And then we have some follow-up questions about that too.
Yeah, certainly. And so maybe for the benefit of those who do not know her, Professor Nadera Shalhoub-Kevorkian is a professor at Hebrew University for several decades, and she's a luminary Palestinian scholar. And she has been conducting critical research about Israeli colonial violence for decades. And through deep ethnographic research, she writes about the lives of families, men, women, children under occupation, and the ways that the Israeli military, the police, and settler violence also shapes their everyday life. She's a feminist scholar, and as a feminist scholar, she has always worked to make the invisible visible, particularly the experiences of Palestinian children who are overwhelmingly invisible still to the international community, and particularly in the West, after decades of dehumanization. And she writes also about how the Israeli state and weapons corporations use the occupied Palestinian territory as a testing ground to refine technologies and then sell them abroad as battle-proven. And for her courageous and uncompromising research, she has for decades not only been discredited, but also silenced and harassed by Hebrew University, by the administration, by her students and her colleagues. But this really escalated with her suspension by the Hebrew University that also led to her arrest. So this began when she signed a petition for ceasefire and condemning Israel's killing of Palestinian children in Gaza. And so Hebrew University's administration, in response, sent Professor Shalhoub-Kevorkian a letter where they took issue with her.
Sorry, Maya, that was back in the fall, right?
That was back in October. Yeah, this was back in October, and they said this is when this whole campaign against her really escalated. And the Hebrew University administration said they were ashamed that Hebrew University includes her as a faculty member, and they ended the letter with saying they believe it is appropriate for her to consider leaving her position. So Hebrew University, of course, knows all too well what it would look like to the international community to fire one of its most high-profile critical Palestinian scholars who has long been tenured from the institution. So the administration instead opted to do what they have been doing for years already, which is trying to compel her to resign herself. But of course, Professor Shalhoub-Kevorkian has not been silenced despite harassment over decades that she has faced by her administration, and she has continued to speak out and to share insights building on her decades of academic research. And then when she did have this conversation with you on this podcast, in which she also spoke about the war crimes committed by the Israeli military and identified herself, as almost all Palestinians do, as an anti-Zionist, this was deemed beyond the pale for Hebrew University, and in response, they decided to ultimately suspend her. And of course, in a classic case of Israeli projection, her critical speech about Israeli genocide in Gaza was framed by Hebrew University as incitement. And in the letter that they announced her initial suspension, the Hebrew University president affirmed that the institution is a Zionist university.
A proud Zionist university.
Yes, precisely. And I think we have to dwell on this for one more moment, because it really, and to really take this seriously, because I think this is indeed a core issue at the heart of the debate about the academic boycott. And I also think that it illuminates the deep entanglement of the Israeli academy, not only with the Zionist project, but also the Israeli state system of apartheid. Because we really have to understand, and we can only understand the suppression of Professor Shalhoub-Kevorkian's research in the context, I think, of the deep institutional complicity of Hebrew University in Israel's colonial system of violence and genocide that she is critically analyzing and has been persistently speaking out against. Because, and this really goes even to her own department. One of the departments in which she is affiliated, in which she teaches, is the Institute of Criminology at Hebrew University. And that department in particular came out against her and fueled the campaign of incitement against her, and accused her of what they said blurring the lines between politics and scientific facts. And this is particularly striking because this is from the same department that conducts research using classified data collected on Palestinians by the Israeli police and Shin Bet through illegal interrogation methods and torture. This is the same department that for years has been training the leadership of Israeli police forces who sustain apartheid through a tailored degree program for the Israeli police. This is the same department that has established deep ties with the Israeli police to offer what they call university-based research and policy recommendations. Simon Perry, among many others in this department, he's a celebrated criminologist in the institute, and he in particular spoke out against Professor Shalhoub-Kevorkian in the media and accused her of falsely stating that Israel is conducting experiments on Palestinians and Palestinian children in East Jerusalem. And this is particularly striking given that Israeli criminologists at this same department, including Perry himself, understand themselves not only as the research and training arm of Israeli policing apparatuses, but also as the pioneers of an international field of what they consider counter-terror policing. Simon Perry himself, put it that Israel has the potential, this is in one of his articles, Israel has the potential to serve as a fascinating research laboratory for studying policing. And the criminologists in this department promote their studies as useful to law enforcement and intelligence and security agencies worldwide and promote what they call best counterterrorism practices. So they themselves advocate the export of Israeli tactics that have been widely condemned for violating Palestinian human rights to countries around the world. And they themselves participate in the showcasing of Israeli models of counterterrorism policing. And they themselves have brought delegates to observe the checkpoints and the comprehensive surveillance system in occupied East Jerusalem. To say nothing of the fact that Israeli military industries themselves that were, openly advertise their products as battle proven. Rafael, among others, calls themselves the National Laboratory of Israel. So the facts of Israel's experimentation and honing and development of technologies and weapons used against occupied Palestinians before their global export is a widely established fact. But when Professor Nadera Shalhoub-Kevorkian, as a critical Palestinian scholar, takes these known facts as the starting point for what she calls decolonial scholarship, when she highlights the devastating costs of these Israeli forms of experimentation on Palestinian men, women, and children, she is accused by her colleagues, by the university administration, and the government of incitement against the Israeli state. And this is, I think this is not a coincidence because of the power of the indictment of her research. So she has really shown that the state of Israel has engaged Palestinian children as combatants, what she calls unchilding. And of course, this has reached unfathomable new heights over the last 8 months in Gaza, with well over 15,000 Palestinian children killed, tens of thousands more maimed, orphaned, and now dying of malnutrition and starvation by Israel. So it should not surprise us that Hebrew University is so forcefully disavowing her research. They went on media to condemn her research and delegitimize her scholarship. They said they strongly condemn the conclusions of her research, and so they really fueled the campaign, the state-led campaign, to silence her and to silence her research and her work. And because of this campaign that was started and fueled by Hebrew University, the Israeli police interrogated Professor Shalhoub-Kevorkian. They kept her under harsh conditions and detained her. They confiscated her computer, her cell phone, her books, her works in progress, many of which were just released to her just last week. And she is still, the investigation against her is still ongoing by the Israeli state. But what is really important is that to highlight is that it is Hebrew University and many of her colleagues and the administration who themselves really fueled this campaign against her and refused to uphold her right to conduct the critical scholarship that she does.
Maya, thank you. I mean, honestly, we all stand, in total support with Nadera, Professor Shalhoub-Kevorkian, and are just appalled by her persecution. It's just shocking, and I guess this brings us to the section about towards the end of this interview with you, or this discussion with you, which is it's so everything, as Karim said, it's so shocking, and Sadi said it's so shocking. It takes time for us to digest and process what you're saying, and yet, when you switch in Canada or the US, how do all these institutions manage to sell or obscure, or in other words, all the programs, the study abroad programs, all the institutional relations between Israeli academics and institutionally I'm talking about, and US and North American academics, are these things just taken for granted? Are they obscured? Do people not look into them? How does that aspect, what's so open, you're saying in Israel, you're saying it's absolutely open and explicit in Israel, they don't hide it, as opposed to here, where in the US and Canada, where it is hidden, is it not? I mean, so how does that, is there a deliberate attempt on the part of Israeli academia to sort of send out a very different image of what Israel is doing? Do you see what I'm saying? Do they sell it differently? And then specifically, I want to ask you about something called the Dan David Foundation, which is, or Dan David.
Sorry, just because I want to add to what you were saying before, because I think the other one is a different question. I'm interested to see not just do the Israelis package it in a certain way, because probably the answer is yes.
And the US, that's what I meant as well.
The question is, how do the Canadians and the Americans and the others, how do they receive it? I mean, how are they able to pretend like it doesn't exist? Is it just done because there's money involved, there's payments, there's just institutional collaborations, or is there some larger political project and pressure that is there to bear? And so the obvious kind of correlate to that is, in this moment of genocide, has that facade, or do you foresee that facade, not just now through the protests, but let's say in the coming months or year or two, this kind of post-genocide where we've been discussing on this podcast quite a bit, with different people and just amongst ourselves, that this genocide seems to me anyway to have stopped a lot of what might have happened before, like this idea of, oh, I didn't know, I couldn't see, I'm not sure, I'm ambivalent, etc. All that stuff. Surely all that disappears when it's happening, it's being live streamed, and all this kind of stuff and the discussion around it, and the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court and the discussion of apartheid, all this stuff is coming. Do you see this as something that will change in the coming months and years?
Yeah, so I think what is really there are several things here. One is the striking doublespeak, where the discourse internally in the Israeli Academy is starkly different from the ways that Israeli universities and their supporters narrate Israeli universities to Western academic audiences. And certainly Israeli university campuses themselves have become sites of Hezbollah, Israeli state propaganda. So you see, for example, at the University of Haifa, the university servicing the highest number of Palestinians because of its location in the Galilee, has been used as a site to bring international delegations, both of academics and policymakers from the West, to purportedly showcase coexistence and democracy, and much in the same ways that universities and other spaces were mobilized by the South African apartheid regime. So this is really right out of the South African playbook. So certainly Israeli universities themselves have been cultivated as sites of Hezbollah. But there's also something else that is going on here that I think is very valuable about PACB's analysis, which is the way in which it illuminates not only the coloniality of Israeli universities, but also the coloniality of our own institutions across the West. Because what was really striking to me is, and this is also what brought me to research and to write this book, is the gatekeeping by Israeli Jewish academics and their supporters in the West that have been allowed for so long to narrate Israeli universities to Western audiences. And their claims have just been taken at face value. And this is really striking, considering that Palestinian scholars, not only in Palestinian universities, but even in Israeli universities, have for decades been writing about, so it's not only PACB, it is also Palestinian scholars based at Israeli universities, scholars of education and others across the social sciences and humanities, have in particular been writing about the experiences of Palestinian students and scholars in Israeli universities, about Palestinian epistemology, Palestinian knowledge production in the Israeli Academy. And that research, some of it is in Hebrew and Arabic, but a large portion of it is in English, published in peer-reviewed journals and presses based out of Europe and North America. And so what is really striking is that this scholarship is broadly not read in the Western Academy. It is just, we do not engage, and I need not tell you this, that Palestinian critique and Palestinian knowledge has not been integrated into the Western academic canon and is not taken up and is not engaged with in the ways that it should be. And I think that is what this Palestine exception in the Western Academy, I think, is now what we are seeing shift and being transformed in a major way through the student uprisings and through the student encampments, where they are demanding that we actually engage with Palestinian scholarship and Palestinian writing. They are developing and designing their own libraries that include texts that have been excluded from their institutional libraries. They are designing new syllabi and political education programming that takes up Palestinian writing in ways that they have not been exposed to in their courses. And so I think that is this Palestine exception is now being interrupted in an unprecedented way because of the courageous student mobilization across campuses. But I think that the coloniality, the long-standing coloniality of our own institutions, and the deep entanglement that we've had with the Israeli Academy has also sustained this silencing of Palestinian critique as well. And so I think that is also what is, one of the things that gets carried over through these deep ties between Israeli universities and Western universities is the silencing of Palestinian critique and Palestinian writing.
Well, and part of that, sort of, Maya, if I may, part of that is this. I mean, I'm in history, and as in the Dan David, or I don't know how you pronounce it, but the foundation and the prize that they offer to historians, for example, now. They offer to junior faculty, I think specifically, several prizes up to $300,000, I think, individually. I mean, it's a lot of money for historians or for scholars anywhere, for that matter. And the branding of it is all about sort of how liberal and how tolerant. And if you look at the topics that are given, it's all about sort of, voices of the oppressed and voices of this and that. But no Palestinians, no Palestine, mentioned whatsoever. And I'm wondering again, are these the kinds of ways in which they package this thing that then get received in U.S. and Canadian and other academia, in Western academia, as a way of saying, you see, these are the kinds of things that Israeli institutions and Israeli academia stands for and represents. This beautiful, tolerant, open-minded, sort of generous sort of spirit, but it's all fairly recent. In other words, and I can't figure out if this goes to Karim's question. I can't figure out if this is just a deliberate plan or is it cognitive dissonance. And in your experience, in way, have you, in terms of how you're presenting your work here in North America, is there pushback? I mean, how do you? That's what I'm trying to figure out. It seems to be that in Israel, you're saying that people are completely complicit and aware of their complicity. They don't see it as complicity, of course. They see it as national duty or whatever they see it as. Here in North America, since I would like to come to end with North America, here in North America, in terms of how, on this end of things, do you see it as people not able to see what you're saying, not able to see what Nadera is saying? Do they refuse, or is it they look at things like the Dan David Prize and say, well, look how brilliant and beautiful this is? Which is it, or how does it work? I'm just trying to understand. Is it cognitive dissonance, or is it a willful? I don't know. It's so astonishing what you're laying out for us.
I think I agree with you. I think that the dehumanization of Palestinians in the West has been so pervasive and so overwhelming. And so it is not only that Palestinian lives do not matter, it's Palestinian voices have been totally disregarded. And this is true for our own institutions of higher education over decades. And there's been such a silencing and such a Palestine exception that has been upheld across the board in our own institutions. And so I think that Israeli propaganda and Israeli self-narration of universities has fallen on fertile ground in that regard, because there has already been, because of the deep anti-Palestinian racism that is pervasive in the Western academy. And I think this speaks more broadly to, I think, the role that Israel plays in U.S. empire and to the investment and deep identification of many Americans with Israel and with Israelis. And we saw this very clearly in response to the events in October. The deep settler, again, thinking about settler allegiances, sometimes we tend to think about settler states as discrete entities where there is a sort of self-contained project of elimination and replacement of indigenous peoples. But there is also, I think, a broader network of settler states, certainly those established under the aegis of the British Empire. And certainly if we're thinking about Israel as a node in U.S. empire, and we take that seriously, we can think about the deep identification, ideological, affective, of many Americans with the project of the Israeli state, with the Zionist project. And so I think that has also shaped, culture, public discourse, media, and it has also shaped the academy. And this has been pervasive. And I think that the lack of the dehumanization of Palestinians has also caused us has also generated a silencing and a lack of serious engagement with Palestinian critique that has really paved the way for this. But I think that what we're seeing right now is a radical break from that we are seeing a generation of students who say we refuse to live in a world where Palestinian lives do not matter. We refuse to live in a world where the Palestine exception is allowed to stand. We refuse to live in a world where our own universities are directly complicit through their investments and through their ties to the Israeli university system in Palestinian unfreedom. And so this is a radical break from a consensus in the U.S. Academy and in the Western Academy more broadly that has been allowed to stand for far too long. And I think what all of us, to my mind, one of the most devastating truths that all of us have to live with, those of us who are inhabiting and sustaining the Western academic system and the Western university, is that we do not know what these last 8 months would have looked like had we heeded the call from PACB, issued over 2 decades ago now, to boycott the Israeli Academy, which is really a pillar of Israeli racial rule, and now an enabler of this genocide. And so I think that all of us in the Western Academy have to really take this seriously and realize that we are already devastatingly too late but that we must begin now. And one immediate step that we all need to take is to end our own direct complicity with Palestinian unfreedom, whether it's through our university investments or through our university collaborations and ties with the Israeli academic system.
Maya, actually, that's a great place for us to wrap up with the call of the Palestinian Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel, PACB. Do you want to reiterate the call? I mean, it was issued, as you said, 2005, I think it was. It was like coming up on 19 years ago now. The call, I mean, just for those of us, I'm sure, I assume our audience knows what the boycott call is, but it's a call for the institutional boycott of Israeli universities by institutions outside, like our own universities, study abroad programs, research collaborations, grants, all these kinds of things. Notably, by the way, it's also if you put it back in comparison with the South African call for boycott of apartheid South Africa, it's much less restrictive than that one, because that was a blanket boycott. Like, you couldn't invite South African scholars to speak, you wouldn't publish their work. This call is not quite so blanket. But I think, Maya, what your work is doing is showing us, this is like, I mean, literally, it's a book. It's like, this is the textbook now on the extent to which these Israeli academic institutions are complicit from the ground up. I mean, even before the ground up, they were laying the foundation for the Zionist settler colonial program in Palestine, for the maintenance of its apartheid system, for the perpetuation of the occupation, for the refinement of the occupation, for the brutalization of Palestinians, either through outright genocide as in Gaza, or more quietly or subtly through what you're saying about the question of language and heritage and history and identity and all these other kinds of things. So it's these institutions are absolutely central to the program of the state. They have been, as you said, before the beginning of the state itself. They will be for as long as this state endures, in some sense. They are the perfect examples. I mean, what you're saying gives us the perfect evidence we need for why an academic boycott is justified. So maybe we can close with your reflecting on the PACB call and the call for the academic boycott, and yeah, just how the genocide makes that more urgent than ever, as you're saying.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that is often overlooked is that, in fact, PACB came out with its call to boycott the Israeli Academy in 2004, so 20 years ago, a full year before the full BDS call was issued. So, in fact, the call for the academic boycott is the foundational call of the BDS movement. And that is because the Palestinian civil society identified the Israeli Academy as a pillar of Israeli racial rule, and in fact called on the international community to boycott the Israeli Academy before it even called to boycott weapons corporations. And so I take that really seriously, and I think all of us need to take that very seriously, that in the Palestinian analysis, the Academy is a central pillar, and that was really the first to be targeted and to be held accountable by Palestinian civil society. And so all of us, those of us, especially students, staff, faculty in the Western university system, need to take that incredibly seriously. And so really that the BDS call and the BDS movement really begins with the call to boycott the Israeli Academy. And I think that what my book really further substantiates is what Palestinians, scholars, intellectuals, activists have for 2 decades now been writing and speaking to, which is the ways in which the Israeli university is a pillar of Israeli settler colonial rule, apartheid regime, and now of genocide. And I think, certainly now when we're seeing the genocide unfold, we're at 8 months now, we haven't even reached a ceasefire. We're thinking about when we come to understand Israeli impunity and what has enabled Israel to carry out this genocide for more than 8 months now. We have to look to Israeli universities as well, because not only have Israeli universities cultivated and produced legal scholarship over decades that have produced innovative interpretations of international humanitarian law and laws of war to sustain Israeli impunity and to prevent Israel from being held accountable for its war crimes. And we're seeing this now also in the ways that the Israeli universities have mobilized against the case brought by South Africa to the ICJ. And so it is in the international arena, thinking about the ways in which the Israeli universities have helped to sustain Israeli impunity and also to legitimate Israel in the international academic community and in the international community more broadly. If we're looking to weapons and to the ways in which Israel has, even in the last 8 months, tried new technologies and weapons against Palestinians in Gaza and has already put them on display in international expos over the last 8 months as battle proven. Israeli universities have been absolutely central. They continue to develop and hone weapons and technologies used in this genocide. They are training soldiers. They are even granting university course credit to soldiers returning from Gaza to their classrooms. They are producing hasbara and propaganda and talking points for the Israeli state to counter the growing criticism, to counter the courageous student uprising across Western universities. And so really what we're seeing is that this genocide, in very material, concrete ways, is being enabled and sustained by the Israeli university system. So it is incredibly urgent, and I agree with you, it is incredibly urgent at this moment to enact the boycott, full boycott, academic boycott of Israeli institutions, so long as they serve as pillars of Israeli racial rule and now of genocide.
Maya, thank you. We couldn't thank you enough for that amazing discussion. Thank you.
Maya, thank you so much, really, honestly.
So, guys, that was an amazing discussion with Maya Wind. What did you think? I mean, I could say from the beginning, well, of course, I read the book, so I know a lot of this stuff, and I know the context and the history and everything else. But nevertheless, to have her lay it out in this way, it's almost like brutalizing listening to it. I mean, she's with all, it's not her, obviously. It's the story itself. But what did you guys think?
Yeah, that's what Karim was saying. He was saying it's a lot to take in, right? I mean, it's just to process all this information. And what's so astonishing is how anachronistic, just the sheer levels of anachronism of Israeli racism, academic racism, institutional racism, and it's so obvious to anyone who just bothers to do a bit of basic research. And yet, I mean, Karim, again, this is where maybe it's a blessing for you to be in a place like Beirut as opposed to, for us in North America. No, in this very marginal sense.
We're just being attacked and invaded by the Israelis.
No, I know. I don't mean that. I mean that just in terms of nobody buys for a second that these are sort of tolerant, liberal places, as opposed to here where we have these constant overt defenses of these institutions that are so racist in a way that any American who knows anything about civil rights or about segregation would be horrified. Truly. No, what do you think, Karim?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been a really interesting kind of discussion. I certainly learned a lot, and I think a couple of things. One is, I mean, personally, I really think it's important to constantly remind myself and all of us. I think that we can talk about the institutions, and it's true that the kind of the BDS and PACB and all of this kind of target institutions when it comes to boycott. This is true. But when it comes down to it, I also insist that it's individuals, it's students, it's professors, it's academics, it's university administrators in these Israeli institutions, universities, that are directly collaborating it. And this has been borne out here. So it's an overwhelming majority are directly, not just inciting genocide in the case of genocide, but have been for many years and decades, directly supporting this apartheid and intimidation of Palestinian students and Palestinian history and Palestinian identity and all of this. It's incredible to me.
It's not institutions in the abstract, in other words.
Yeah, it's not an abstract. I mean, what one could have the discussion about structures and institutions. Of course, that's an important unit of analysis. But in the end, when it comes down to it, we're talking about people. We're talking about individuals collectively. The overall, it's not like 50%, 49%. It is an overwhelming majority, and so you can point to and almost count the individuals that go against this. I'm talking about among the Jewish Israelis.
I think I know both of them.
Yeah, I mean it's a handful of people, and I insist that this needs to be highlighted. So I think that's one thing that's important to kind of that I found that I want to really kind of emphasize. And the other thing, which the question of Judaism, I hadn't realized. Of course, we should remind all the viewers that Israeli universities are all public, right? I think, as far as I know, that I don't think there's many, or if there are any private or anything, they're all basically state public. That's why. So the whole question of Judaization and the extent I mean, I knew they were linked, but the extent to which Maya was laying out, the extent to which these universities, the big universities that all of us have heard of, and the militarization and the kind of racial discrimination that's produced across from the beginning of its history on, even before its history. In the case of what was it, Haifa or Hebrew University, is in the
Hebrew University.
mandate,
Yeah.
yeah. So
We didn't even talk about the Orientalists. The Orientalists in Hebrew
there's all sorts
University.
of things,
Yeah.
right? So all this, or the production, or the way in which the Israelis, through the Europeans, kind of launched on this campaign, or UNRWA, on the Palestinian history textbooks, the way in which Israelis are obsessed about erasing the kind of Palestinian history. So this, I mean, that's a whole other topic of conversation. But the extent to which the extent to which these universities, so in this case institutionally, are connected to the military, to the violence, to the apartheid, to all of it. It's not, there's some university people that are.
Her book goes through that in absolute detail, like bit by bit,
Exactly, but I'm making the point that it's not just that for example, in the U.S. and some there's certain departments or certain professors that work and have funding from X, Y, or Z. The university themselves come out of that, and they are directly part of it. So on top of that, you have the individuals that I'm referring to. Is that these universities are directly out of this militarization and Judaization of historic
Actually,
Palestine.
Karim, sorry, it's just to refine your point. It's not that the universities come out of the program of settler colonialism. The universities produced the program of settler or participated in it from that was one of the points that she was making. So
In 20, and the point ultimately is that this is all in 2024. I mean, it's been going on for decades, but this is not a 19th century. So for those who want, and she made the comparison with settler colonial institutions in the West, the difference is that those were 19th century, for the most part, institutions, and or early 20th century institutions. And at least they've made some attempt at decolonizing, as they call it here.
no, that's
some of
very
the
important.
No,
That's
of course it
very
is important.
Yeah,
Of course, I mean, because things change, and nothing is.
Yeah.
And the point
And
is,
our institutions, like the one that you and I are both in, the University of California, for all of institutionally speaking, from the upper administration, the regions, all the rest of it, they've had this baleful, like on the question of the Palestine encampments, they've been horrendous as institutions. But there are dozens and dozens and dozens, and even hundreds at this point, of faculty and student and staff mobilizing against it. So there is a space for critique that the universities, no matter how baleful and complicit they are, they allow a space for critique, whereas the Israeli universities do not allow. It gets
exactly, which gets us to the point again of anachronism, which is and the willful blindness of people in this country to not see the anachronism when it's so obvious and evident.
And so, a final word, I think, for us that connects this is the case that we talked about, and of course is the Nadera case. And I think this is, I mean, in a sense, I would imagine, and you guys know more maybe about this, but I mean, Nadera, in a sense, she's a star in academia and in circles. So when she's being attacked and imprisoned and tortured and discriminated against and all that, her name kind of carries around. And so there are a lot of people that are in solidarity with her, including us, of course, and that support her, and such as it is. Whereas God knows all sorts of other people that we've never heard of that undergo this, both structurally, so before they even do anything, and then if they somehow cross a line that the Zionists themselves kind of set, they disappear and we don't even know who they are. Large number. So we need to be in solidarity with everybody.
Well said, Karim.
Yeah, it was a great conversation. I learned a lot from it.
Okay, thanks, guys.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye, guys.